just sort of saying, this is what I'm thinking about.
A journalist once asked me about what is my objective as a writer, and I said, well, the primary objective has to be to entertain. And then along the way, if you could educate or enlighten, that's great.
Sure.
Is there an objective in your mind when you write? Or is it simply that, listen, I need to get the reader to turn the page?
Well, that's certainly part of it. You want the reader to turn the page. I mean, I absolutely have an objective. I have an objective which is to share ideas, share information that's fascinating to me, but do it in a way that you don't feel it happening. You know, you're reading a thriller about this guy running through Florence, and you don't realize that you're learning quite a bit about the Divine Comedy, or about the baptistry, or about the history of Florence. I had this old woman come up to me once, and she said, I don't know whether, I think this is one of the nicest things a reader's ever said to me. It's a very strange comment. She said, you know what? Your books are like eating my vegetables, but it tastes like ice cream. So,
I love that.
yeah.
There are several people here who've actually asked this particular question. What do you read? Who is your favorite author?
I read you.
Oh, well, you just made my day.
You know, it's funny, for a fiction writer, I read almost no fiction. I read nonstop, but it's almost exclusively nonfiction. I'm always reading, whether it's science or philosophy or religion or history, or I'm always looking for new ideas, trying to formulate my ideas. I love fiction, but when I'm writing fiction, I prefer to read nonfiction. So that's about all I read.
Okay. Any personal favorites in terms of authors?
So many. I mean, I just finished a book by Michio Kaku about it was called How to Create a Mind, and it's about the future of artificial intelligence. Just fascinating. So that's
okay. Somewhere I read in an interview of yours where you said that you love writing about villains who do the wrong things for the right reasons.
yes.
So could you explain that a little, to our audience here?
You know, thrillers are really about villains. Because if Robert Langdon had nobody to push up against him, he'd have a very boring life. These would be books about him just sort of giving lectures in Cambridge. So you need a Moloch or a Silas. And in this last book, Inferno, the nicest thing that I heard about Inferno was I'm not sure if this character is a villain or a hero. And ideally, I believe, if you do your job right in creating your villain, he or she is an interesting person in that you can see their point of view. You can say, you know what, I kind of get the point. Mm-hmm. I can sort of see why you might feel that way.
That's right.
Of course, in Inferno, I don't know if you've read it, I won't ruin it, but in Inferno, somebody takes just drastic action on a very serious problem. And it's a serious problem in that you can say, you know what, it's a serious enough problem that it requires drastic action, so maybe he is right. And we don't know if he's a hero or a villain. He's one of my favorite villains I've written.
So almost a gray character in that sense.
Always gray. You always need to be able to argue both sides of the equation.
Lovely. Why Dante's Divine Comedy? I mean, this is a question which I was wondering, I said, what is it that inspires someone to suddenly pick up Dante's Divine Comedy and
Madness.
Then say that I want to write a book about it, a thriller?
It's amazing. Dante, the Divine Comedy and Dante are, Dante is one of these writers that we all say, oh yeah, Dante, I know what that is. And then you think about it and you're like, actually, I don't really. We all sort of feel like we've read it, we know what it is, it's part of the culture, but when we think about it, it's kind of remote, it's distant. And I read the Divine Comedy in high school, and then was amazed when I read it how modern it felt for something written in the 1300s. The reason I chose to write about specifically Inferno, which is part of the Divine Comedy, is that Dante's vision of hell is really where we get the Christian tradition of hell. The Bible mentions hell, but just in passing. There's no structure to hell, no vivid picture. And the Greeks and the Romans talked about hell a little bit. But it really wasn't until Dante that we had this incredible image of hell as the place we go if we are bad or if we don't accept religion. And it was a boon for the Christian church to be able to say, hey, look, you come here on Sunday or that's what's waiting for you. And so it's a fascinating piece of literature. It has affected the world in enormous ways.
Was it a daunting task to take up something like that?
Sure. Well, you know what? I'd written about the fine arts,
Right.
but I'd never written about the literary arts.
Mm-hmm.
So on some level, Dante spoke to me as a landscape that's familiar. It's filled with symbols and codes and art and history and all of that. But it's also different somehow. It is a daunting Dante task. It is a daunting task to look at I forget how many lines are in the poem, but it's a 14,000 line epic poem and say, I'm going to make this interesting to a farmer in Missouri. That's...
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things I think that for a lot of Indians at least, the reason why the Da Vinci Code struck such a chord with Indians was the fact that you brought alive the entire concept of the sacred feminine.
Yes.
And this is a country which has worshipped Shakti for thousands and thousands of years.
Well, you're smarter than we are. What can I say? That's right.
I was wondering. Thank you. The question was that somewhere along the way, do you think that there is much more across the world that unites us than divides us? And is that one of the objectives with which you write?
Thank you for saying that. So astute to notice that and say that. There is so much that unites it. And I just said tonight, our religions are all similar. We're all saying the same thing. And it's amazing that we can fight over which name for God happens to be the right God. And somehow we can kill each other over it. And it just makes no sense whatsoever. And I really believe that there will come a time in human history when we start to understand this. And there is either a universal religion, which is just a melding of everything, or just a global sense of tolerance. Saying, you call God that, I call it this, but we're really just talking about the good big thing, whatever we want to call it.
That's right.
And my hope is that it's coming. And I think educating ourselves is an enormous part of that. And certainly that's one of the reasons I write, to try to point out similarities across the world.
Lovely. When you write, do you find that a book changes you? Does your point of view undergo a transformation after every book?
Yes, and it's very dangerous because you're writing the book from one point of view, and if you start to change your point of view, it means an awful lot of revision. So I try to be pretty firm on my point of view before I start, but certainly the research process. For example, in the book Inferno talks about this issue of overpopulation in the world, which is an enormous problem. We 80 years ago, there were 1/3 as many people on Earth as there are today. The population of Earth has tripled. There's probably somebody in this room who's 80 years old who was born into a world with 1/3 as many people. Now, that is a staggering statistic, and it's a terrifying statistic. And I truly believe, as do many people, that all of our environmental issues and social issues, whether it's no clean water or pollution or whatever it is, these are systemic problems that come from overpopulation. And so I went into the research of Inferno saying, I want to write about this. And by the time I was finished with the research, I was convinced that it was so critical that the human race curb its population that I was willing to create a much darker villain than I would have at the beginning of the research. So from that standpoint, my viewpoint did change.
But does that happen with almost every book?
Certainly, well, of course, because the reason I choose topics that require research is because I like to learn. And you can't learn without changing your mind. That's almost the definition of learning.
That's right.
That your perspective of the world changes because you have more information. And I know we have a lot of students here, and I'm sure you've all had this experience where the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And, we laugh, but it's true. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, th- Somewhere along the way, do you think that in your life there have been some aha moments which have been the sort of, you thought about that moment and you said, oh, that's a story. I mean, where does your inspiration really come from?
Yeah, I mean, there are moments like that. I do remember I was with my wife in Rome, and I knew I wanted to write about science and religion. I was researching angels and demons. I wanted to write about science and religion. I wasn't sure what the landscape would look like, who the characters would be, how I would put it together. And we had some connections at the Vatican, connections which have since disappeared. Oops. But we were given a tour of the Pasetto, this tunnel between the Vatican and Castle St. Angelo, which at that point wasn't open, and it is now. We were getting this tour, and I asked this woman, I said, what was this tunnel used for? And he said, well, it was to usher, when a pope was in danger, if the Vatican was being attacked, we could usher the pope out to this castle, or to this fortress, where he would be safe. I said, well, what kind of enemies? And she went on and talked about how, there were a lot of science-minded people. When Galileo was put under house arrest, there were a lot of people who weren't too happy about that, who felt that he was one of the brightest minds on earth and had some truths to share. And a lot of people were after the Pope. And I suddenly had this image of sort of cloaked scientists coming after the Pope. And I thought, running down torchlit corridors, and I thought, that's angels and demons.
That's right.
Here it comes. And it sort of poured in from there. So that was an aha moment.
Wonderful. There's a quip which says that you should never judge a book by its movie. What do you feel about the movies that have been made regarding your books?
Yeah.
I mean, because after all, as writers, we are always in love with what we write. So obviously, there is a certain process of sort of letting go.
Sure. Yeah.
So, how does that work for you?
The adaptation process is a strange one for a writer because the movie is really someone else's child. They're telling your story, but they're telling it your way. The Da Vinci Code, for example, is a very difficult movie to make. It's long. It's got a lot of flashback, a lot of history. What I believe is that all any author can ask for when Hollywood or Bollywood or whoever it is makes your movie is that the filmmakers stay true to the pulse and the heartbeat and the spine and the message of your book. Sure, the characters